Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us. I'm Janice Kamada-Resnick, and on behalf of Jews United for Democracy and Justice and Community Advocates, Inc., welcome to our program tonight. A special welcome to our guest, the always informative and wonderful Bill Kristol, and to the wonderful and always informative and interesting Patt Morrison. Thank you both for helping continue our learning curve and our ability to engage on these important issues. Thanks to our leadership team, former Congressman Mel Levine, former LA County Supervisor Zev Yaroslavsky, David Lair, Caroline Kelly, and Rabbi Ken Chazen. The link to all of our past programs is in each email we send out. If you can't find it there, you can always email me by just replying to any email you get from me and from Judge, and I will respond, as you all know who do contact me. Let's see. If you're having a problem registering, I can do it for you. If you can't figure out how to clear your cache, either ask your kids, your grandkids, your great-grandkids. I think young kids can do it. We can't. But if you can't figure it out, I'll be happy to register you. Thank you to those of you who are donating continuously to help us present these programs. We are grateful. And as long as you keep supporting us, we can continue this pretty amazing weekly series now in its 4th year. Next week, we are very excited to bring Michigan Governor Gretchen Whitmer to America at a Crossroads. Governor Whitmer defied many prevailing practices by winning over tens of thousands of Trump voters to vote for her in her election to her 2nd term as Michigan's governor. She is a much-loved governor from a key battleground state from whom we will undoubtedly gain a great deal of insight we need as we enter what will surely be a trying and difficult year of elections. The governor will be in conversation with Larry Mantle. It should be a wonderful program. The following week on May 31st, we welcome the award-winning journalist and author Nicholas Kristof of the New York Times. He is the winner of 2 Pulitzer Prizes. He writes about human rights, women's rights, global affairs, health, and lots of other subjects as well. He will be in conversation with Madeline Brand. We hope that you'll join us for all of these programs and more. And for a couple of additional announcements, my friend and colleague, David Lair. David?
Thank you, Janice. Welcome, everyone. Following up on the programs that Janice just mentioned, on June 7th, we'll explore legal issues from imminent Supreme Court rulings to Trump's several setbacks to the assaults on school curriculum and teachers. We will be bringing back one of the most able and engaging analysts of legal issues around, Neil Katyal, the former Solicitor General of the United States. He just argued his 50th case before the U.S. Supreme Court. He'll be in dialogue with Warren Alvey. The following week, Warren will again host with the Washington Post's distinguished op-ed columnist and renowned military historian, Max Boot. Following Boot, the New York Times chief Washington correspondent Peter Baker will join us with Larry Mantle. And June will close out with the Atlantic and CNN's data maven, Ron Brownstein, a friend of our guest tonight, in dialogue with Madeline Brand. Our moderator is Patt Morrison. She's a Pulitzer Prize-winning columnist for the Los Angeles Times, a best-selling author, and the recipient of 6 Emmys and 12 Golden Mikes for her work on TV and radio. She's always probing and always thoughtful and a delight to work with. Pat?
David, thank you so much. Thank you to everyone who is joining this program tonight and for supporting it as well. Bill Kristol, whom you may know from other programs here, is the editor-at-large of The Bulwark. He's also director of DefendingDemocracyTogether.org and a voice of reason crying in the wilderness. I think we're more than justified in saying. Bill, thank you for being here.
Pat, great to be with you and great to be with all of you again.
This news week reminded me of a comment by Dorothy Parker, the writer and wit, who said every time her doorbell rang, the thought that crossed her mind was, what fresh hell is this? So we have so many circles of hell to choose from this week, but I'll start with the one that seems most urgent and certainly the one that's getting a lot of attention, which is the debt ceiling and the negotiations between the White House and Congress. President Biden has truncated his scheduled trip abroad in order to bring more negotiations, more talk to the table to try to bring a resolution of this before June 1st, which seems like a long way away, but there's only X working days until June 1st to make this happen. So what is your assessment of what's at stake here? What's going on after 3 years of Republicans voting to support President Trump's lifting of the debt ceiling, all of a sudden we have a newly empowered Republican Congress saying, "No, I don't think so."
Yeah, I mean, I'm struck that President Biden cut short. He's going to go to the summit, but then he's not going to go on to Australia, where he was going to announce, celebrate, mark the agreement that the U.S. made with Australia, the UK, and it wasn't someone else. I'm blanking on it. A pretty important, military agreement, though, that beefs up our ability to in the Pacific and in effect to contain China. So that was kind of a, presidential trips. I was in the White House years ago. They're planned a long time in advance. Other governments don't like it much when you cancel at the last minute. So it tells me they're both serious about the negotiations and worried about what's happening. I think if it was on autopilot, President Biden's got perfectly competent staff and perfectly competent cabinet secretaries like Janet Yellen who can handle these negotiations. He obviously felt he has to come back and either get it done or be there to make clear that it's not his responsibility if it doesn't get done. It's people like me have been around Washington, just assume these negotiations always get done on the debt ceiling. It would be so dangerous to start, I don't know, defaulting on our debt or even raising that prospect in a serious way, or not being able to pay the government's bills or not sending out Social Security checks and the like. But, this is not the Republican Party that it was 10 years ago. It was a Tea Party influence party then, and they had tough negotiations in 2011, but they still, John Boehner was the speaker. And, there were enough people in the party who wanted to get it done that they did and Joe Biden played a big role in those negotiations. So he knows a lot about this kind of thing. He was vice president. Whereas now, I think he's genuinely worried. I mean, the other thing that's happened is Kevin McCarthy, I'm not a huge fan of his, but pulling the Republican Party together in the House enough to get their budget passed and the debt ceiling increased with the budget was pretty impressive politics. It was a lot of deal making. They ended up with in my view, a very bad piece of legislation. But he now gets to say, and this is why things have changed so much in the last week or two. So, we passed a budget with the debt ceiling increase on it. What's your counter proposal? So I've got to say that in the short term, I think 2 months ago, if we'd had this conversation, the conventional wisdom would have been Biden knows what he's doing. The White House knows what they're doing. Kevin McCarthy's in charge of an unruly House Republican conference with a very small majority. They don't have much leverage ultimately because he can't hold them together. But his ability to hold them together has given him a little more leverage in this discussion.
Something you mentioned a bit earlier, how much of this is for providing an opportunity to put this all on President Biden if things go bluey?
I mean, Donald Trump said last week, basically, they should default. And someone said, well, when you were president, you said it would be a disaster if the U.S. defaulted on its debt, if we didn't raise the debt ceiling when we had to. And how aren't you being inconsistent? And I think Trump said something, I think I'm quoting almost exactly. Well, I was president then, and I'm not president now. I mean, it's pure politics from Trump's point of view. Hopefully some of the House Republicans are a little more responsible, but you do get electoral politics in here, and you hate to assume that elected members of Congress want the economy to suffer, but they certainly want to make Biden pay a price, maybe cause some fights among Democrats. Some of the progressives won't like some of the things Biden might have to swallow in this deal. I guess I assume they'll end up with a deal, and it won't fundamentally change much about the size and shape of our government. Because whatever deal they make could be changed, 2 years from now, depending on who wins the election, obviously. Still, it is, I think, for those, I guess I'll put it this way, for those people, many of them friends of mine, who don't like Kevin McCarthy, don't respect him much, think he's just kind of stumbled from one thing to another while managing to kind of cling to power by his fingernails. There's some truth to all of that, but he did cling to power. He survived those 15 ballots for speaker. And people said, oh my God, how embarrassing. You know what? He pulled it off. He's speaker. And now he's passed the budget by one vote, I think, in the House, which has enabled him to to negotiate with President Biden as an equal almost. I mean, Biden's going to come back and sit across the table from Kevin McCarthy. So it's a good lesson that, even if one's opponents in politics are not super impressive, super principled, super admirable, they can, if they're clever and if they're persistent, you still have to deal with them. And McCarthy has done better than people expected a few months ago.
That George Santos vote mattered then.
Yeah, right. I mean, but Santos is another thing. Well, also the Democrats, if I could just say, are kind of bad at this. I mean, if George Santos, if the shoe were on the other foot, and George Santos were a Democratic member of the House, I mean, every Republican leader would just be screaming and yelling about all that. This is the party of George Santos. The Democrats are, can you believe that they've got this guy as a member of their conference? They haven't done anything to discipline him, tiny bit, getting him off a couple of committees. They're very good at the Republicans are at making the Democrats responsible for their least attractive, their least defensible members, right? I mean, they sort of, one member says something really bad from our point of view, I think, about Israel, and suddenly that's the whole Democratic Party is becoming anti-Israel. The Democrats, maybe because they're not quite as ruthless or quite as shameless, don't really do this to the Republicans very well. So they've criticized Santos, and there's a resolution to try to, but the fact is they have not made Kevin McCarthy pay much of a price. I mean, think about it, Pat. I mean, for Gosar or for Santos or for Gates. I mean, they're all kind of floating around, and of course, they're pretty, they're not, the Republicans aren't idiots. They're not featuring those people, but the Democrats could do more to feature them, I should say, I would think, as the face of the Republican Party. They're just not that great at that kind of politics.
Well, there's always been political theater in this, certainly with the debt ceiling, but I wonder how much of it is this true anarchic digging the heels in when we have people like Chip Roy, a Republican of Texas, warning that if President Biden tried to use the 14th Amendment to dodge the debt ceiling, to essentially make more money, that he would blow crap up. And crap in this sense is the full faith and credit of the United States, our international economic standing, our domestic stability, the programs and people who depend on the budget operating. Is that more posturing, or is that a serious rump element of this Congress?
No, there's certainly an element of the Republican Party today, and it's not as small an element as it once was. It's just thinks, I guess, either is pure politics, or they genuinely believe the federal government does nothing useful, that it couldn't care less about our international prestige or whatever, or even the solidity of the treasury bills, I suppose. I mean, if you made them stop for a minute, I suppose they would get worried about that, what would happen to the economy and so forth. But they kind of think they can probably blame the Democrats. And there's a certain kind of nihilistic or anarchic or kind of attitude, you might say, with them. And we do pay a price. I mean, I was in Europe last week. Where was I? Berlin, Prague, and Vilnius. A lot of private meetings trying to help out a little of the Ukraine situation. Sort of. Anyway, I won't bore you with all the details of it, but happy to talk more about that if you want. But I was struck how much. I mean, they follow American politics closely. We are their biggest ally. We are the leader of the alliance. They know we can get a lot done if we work together, but we have to be there and be shouldering our burden and be reliable and responsible. They look at Trump saying that he's being pro-Putin basically and anti-Ukraine. They look at DeSantis flip-flopping on Ukraine and Republicans being a little uncertain, and Trump being the Republican frontrunner, number one. And number two, they look at this debt ceiling thing and they just think this is nuts. The U.S. The dollar is the reserve currency of the world economy. And what are we're going to blow up sort of, or at least damage the world economy considerably? Why? Because we won't pay our debts. Because we have fights about budgets, which every country has, incidentally, and they don't default on their debt when they have a fight about the budget. So they just look at it and they think, and it does have an effect. Can we trust that superpower? We're going to go along with them and really take some risks domestically. Our energy prices are going up. People are paying more for energy in Germany and the Czech Republic, but we're willing to do it. It's the right thing to help Ukraine and to help pay more to spend more on defense. What if the U.S. is just going to turn around and not fulfill its debts or not pay its debts or abdicate leadership if they elect Trump again? Then a normal politician in one of these countries says, why should I stick my neck out? So it really does have an effect, even if it doesn't happen. The very fact that one of our two major parties is willing to kind of play around with the possibility of it happening really has an effect.
It's Solomonic in a very real sense, in terms of the baby could get cut into pieces here if some people had their way. Want to remind you, if you have questions for Bill Kristol, you can put them in the Q&A box and we'll try to get to them a little later in the program, the questions you may have for Bill Kristol as you follow along with what we're talking about. On Twitter, I noticed that you named the deplorable of the week to be Senator Tommy Tuberville of Alabama, who was asked, do you believe we should allow white nationalists in the military? And his response, well, they call them that. I call them Americans.
I mean, Tuberville's been, yeah, I think Charlie Sykes called him the guess this deplorable of the week award, which he gave him. No, I've been sort of on Tuberville's case, partly just because of these idiotic and not just idiotic, but offensive things he says. But also, he is personally holding up the approval, Senate approval for the promotion of almost 200 senior military officers, the way, the Senate has to approve general officers, basically, and very senior military, the promotions of them. Mostly it's 98% of the time it's pro forma. Occasionally someone comes up who's controversial and then they debate it. But in any case, this one senator, because he disapproves of President Biden's policies on paying for travel for members of the service members to get an abortion or consider getting an abortion if they wish to. And that's a policy dispute about whether the U.S. government should pay for that travel or not. But in any case, to a state which provides abortion services, because of that dispute, he's holding up these promotions. And again, this is a case where I really think the Democrats have they've made, I mean, Elizabeth Warren has spoken about it, Chris Coons, they've gone to the floor a couple of times, but they haven't really put the Republicans on the spot. I think Schumer should keep the Senate in and make the Republicans vote on each of these promotions. Obviously, it'd take a long time to do 200. I think after about 2 or 3 votes, they would override Tuberville, they would break cloture, and then the Republicans would just say to Tuberville, give it up, But they haven't really made the rest of the Republicans pay a price. Tuberville's, I think, paid some price politically, perhaps, and who knows if they care in Alabama. But I mean, this is a case where it's sort of important. If you've got promotion scheduled, people have other, it backlogs the whole system. Families are planning on moving and so forth at a certain time, and suddenly they can't because they not yet confirmed, the Senate hasn't approved the promotion. It's people are held in. Anyway, it's bad. Obviously it's bad in the military.
Well, in the larger sense too, this shows once again the somewhat antique conventions of the Senate. We had Senator Dianne Feinstein, the senior senator from California, return to the Senate after a months-long absence from shingles and telling a reporter no, that she'd been there voting the whole time. And there are protocols about her replacement who might not be able to fully replace her if she were to step down at this point. Is the United States Senate showing its collective age as well as its individual age to our detriment?
There's a lot of individual age. Well, it is, but it's also showing us that, look, all these institutions, whatever the particular rules for how we would approve or not approve the promotion of military officers, maybe that's unnecessary and should just be gotten rid of. But all these norms, conventions, processes depend on some good faith. So underlying good faith, trust, give and take. I mean, obviously, we've all been involved in a million different associations, civic associations, homeowner associations, clubs, synagogues, you name it, right? If anyone wanted to put, if everyone pushed every rule to the limit of where you could go, if there wasn't a certain amount of just compromise, bargaining, yes, we'll let this one go through, you let this one go through sort of attitude, we're not going to enforce every single, take advantage of every possible loophole, nothing would work. No association could work. No government can work that way. We saw that with the Electoral College. Whatever its problems, the way the votes been counted over a couple hundred years has worked. The actual counting has worked once the states determined who had won until the last election, and Trump and his allies tried to take advantage of some ambiguities, and not real ambiguities, but sort of ambiguities, and in the way the 1876 or whatever it was act was written, and they took the Congress did fix that a little bit in last year, but again, it really does show that if you need a certain amount of just civic spirit and a willingness to make the system work, to go out of your way a little bit to make the system work. And if one party or if a chunk of one party really is willing to just forget about that. And again, it's one thing if you matter of super important principle, you're going to shut down the Senate because this is a matter of fundamental civil liberties or fundamental justice, and we're going to have a filibuster and that's okay. Mr. Smith goes to Washington or whatever. That's one thing. This is the routine promotion, but important promotion of 200 senior military officers, just stopping that because of a policy dispute, which he has a particular point of view on, that the Senate does start to come down. And again, I think Democrats could play a little more hardball, force the other Republican senators to take a position. When asked, at the Bulwark have asked them actually tried to get a lot of them on the record. What do you think about it? They just tend to duck and say something vague. I hope we can work it out. they're not paying any price politically, and they should. I mean, for it's totally irresponsible behavior.
And just today, the Secretary of Defense said that his actions undermine readiness, injure military families, and ultimately put our national security at risk. That's the point that, as you indicate, should be made to some of the senators to essentially say, what side of that are you on?
And I mean, honestly, if I were running, I don't know, if I were running the Democratic National Committee, I'm sure I'd have a million things I'd want to spend money on, but it wouldn't be crazy to put up ads in a few states that have a lot of veterans, that have some Republican senators who are up for re-election in 2024, saying this guy is sitting there doing nothing while his close buddy, Tommy Tuberville, and just put up some photo of the two of them together in the Republican conference, is stopping military promotions. And as you just, and then quote the Secretary of Defense. It's also not just the current Secretary of Defense. I think there was a letter from 8 or something 9 previous secretaries of defenses from both parties saying this is very dangerous and damaging.
Speaking of unwritten rules and gentlemanly conventions, we saw the publication by ProPublica of its investigation into Clarence Thomas, his friendship with a man who has underwritten expensive vacations, has bought and maintained, I guess, his Clarence Thomas's mother's home, other benefits for which Clarence Thomas may have cast votes that turned out to be to the benefit of this man or his organizations. And today we had the Supreme Court uphold an Illinois ban on assault weapons. So yes, there's a vote that is going to anger some of the right wing here, but what's going on with the Supreme Court when its credibility seems to be under attack? What is Chief Justice Roberts even able to do to hold together the reputation of a court before it goes out of town in June, and we'll see what's going to happen over the summer? But my goodness, it seems like he's got ropes pulling in every direction on him.
He does. Look, I think the reputation of the court has suffered in recent years, and I think it deserves to have suffered. I mean, a lot of my friends here, lawyers, the ones who are lawyers, it's terrible that the court's under a cloud. Well, if it's under a cloud, one reason it's under a cloud is that it's actually under a cloud. They overturned Roe v. Wade, basically 5-4, with 5 recently appointed justices, 5 Republican appointed justices, including 3 by President Trump, including one who was confirmed 8 days before the election in 2020, just not even really making much of an argument or looking at a middle ground to move in a certain direction if that's what they thought was right, but just saying, that decision was ridiculous, never had any good basis, you were just overturning it, period. That kind of, again, to the way they did it, that's a reason you can debate Roe v. Wade, but the way they did it was so contemptuous of almost 50 years of jurisprudence that hadn't gone in that direction, and good faith efforts to try to work out what the right thing to do was. And I think this is true. I think Clarence Thomas has his views. I don't think he's been influenced by Harlan Crow or anything like that. But not to see that this is unseemly, that this is a mistake. Maybe he, kind of got suckered into it, but got accustomed to it, and they are friends, and he just thought, well, this is very nice, but not to sort of say, you know what, I've thought about this. I regret doing this. I hope it hasn't hurt the court. I'm certainly not going to do it in the future. But instead, that's not the position, right? that would be what I would say a normal reaction would be. If maybe you haven't done anything illegal, and maybe in your heart you haven't done anything wrong in the sense that your vote wasn't bought, but you sort of apologize with the damage you've done, at least to the perception of the court. And incidentally, the standard for judges and other public officials isn't just actually being bribed or something, it's the appearance of impropriety, right? But not to have any sense of apology or concern, I think that's very bad. I think the court's not in good shape. I'm told by people, gossip mill, kind of people who talk to the justices and to the clerks, that it really is not collegial the way it once was. That there's a lot of tension in the actual conferences, a lot of almost bitterness on the part of some of the justices. I think especially Thomas and Alito, even though they're winning in a lot of these issues. I think Chief Justice Roberts, who I respect, is probably trying to kind of hold it together. But again, his way of holding it together is to say sort of, well, nothing to see here, no problem, don't criticize the court. Not to say, we do have a problem here, and let's be more serious about addressing it. So it's yet another institution in our country, one of the guardrails, that I'd say on the whole, the courts over the last 6-7 years have been one of the better guardrails. Not maybe on Roe v. Wade, but on election stuff and on Trump's efforts to really just shred the rule of law. So on the one hand, you could say the courts have kind of held the line mostly. On the other hand, they haven't entirely, and some of these later newer appointments are pretty contemptuous, I would say, of not just the precedent, but even the rule of law, that judge in Texas. But again, that institution is fraying too, and this is one of the damage. This is one of the indirect, or I guess direct, effects of Trump. You get a president who just launches a full-out assault on the rule of law. Other institutions can push back and hold the line for a while, but eventually they also start to have problems. And this is where I really worry about our democracy. And these people in Europe look at what's going on, and the Thomas thing, they don't follow very closely that, but even they look at that. They all have courts, right? They all have some version of a Supreme Court, and they have their own corruption problems, some of these countries. And if something happens sort of in terms of people getting money, but they don't, but the idea that it just gets shrugged off, and that half the country is basically says, okay, Thomas did nothing wrong. And Wall Street Journal rallies to defend Thomas, and National Review, and conservatives all over the place, conservative members of Congress. People over there look at that and think, I don't know, is that really the way it's supposed to work in a democracy?
Well, we have a lot of questions that principally about Congress, but the idea of what happened to the practical middle. I mean, Ellen asks, why aren't non-Trump supporting Republicans joining with Democrats to approve or eliminate the debt ceiling? Where's the logic? Where's the sensible decision making that keeps the country going? Or have the corners been painted so brightly that nobody can be, certainly no Republican can afford to be in the middle and survive?
I mean, that's in a way what polarization means. We use that term a lot, partisanship, and then really beyond partisanship, real polarization of a country. And it's sort of abstract political science, social science term. And sometimes we see it in the voting patterns, but it also, this is what it means in terms of governance, right? Moderate Republicans, so-called moderate Republicans, for whatever reason, because they lose a primary, that suffer the fate Liz Cheney suffered, they would be disciplined by their own parties in their own states, or because they just rationalize it and they, well, it's better to keep together and let's help Kevin cut a good deal. I don't want to be the person who deserts, so I'll just get hammered by everyone. It's hard to know. I mean, you can rationalize. One thing I've learned so much over the last, I think, 6, 7, 8 years, rationalization is a very powerful force, and people can talk themselves into things that are also in their own self-interest and also allow them to take an easier path. And they can tell themselves, I think I can do more good by staying in good shape with Kevin McCarthy, because I can influence them privately if we really get to the crunch. And if I just break now, I'm just making this up, but this is what they tell themselves, some of them. If I break now, I'll just be an outcast like Liz Cheney and have no influence. But then when it comes to the crunch, they don't really do anything either, right? Because they still have to get along, with McCarthy. And so there's an awful lot of that going on, has been going on, obviously, in the Republican Party and in the conservative movement. And it's happened so long that I've sort of given up, honestly, hoping that this batch of elected officials will do much better. Now, maybe in the debt ceiling, it's so bad an outcome, and it doesn't take so many Republicans to deserve it, that maybe at the end of the day, you do get, some of the Republicans doing the right thing despite political pressure. But that we keep hoping for that, and it certainly doesn't happen often.
Well, on the flip side, Lois says, why aren't the Democrats more inclined to play hardball?
I mean, it's not so it's not so easy. They have to govern. They have the White House. Whenever you have the White House, there's a tendency to sort of, say, well, that hardball is easy to say. And people like me can say, if I were at the DNC, I'd do this. But if you're President Biden, you also would like to get some stuff through. He did, to his credit, get a lot of stuff through in 2022. He needed Republican votes for that. He got some of it through. So if he were on this show, he would say, Bill, that's very nice what you're saying, but down the road, I'm going to need Republican votes on Ukraine. I'm going to need Republican votes on some things. We're going to have to just suffer through this a little bit now, and I'm not going to go beat them all up. The votes I need, I'm not going to say they're just like George Santos or they're just, horribly irresponsible legislators. So it's a little bit of they're in a tougher position. You're in a tougher position, ironically, when you have the White House and you feel responsible for governing. And President Biden, I think, does really feel responsible. Coming out of the pandemic, he's got to get the economy stabilized, get inflation a little bit down while keeping growth going. Very challenging world situation, hold the alliance together. And, it's to his credit, I think, in a way that he hasn't played that much politics. I'd say if you think of all the presidents we've had in the last 30, 40 years since I came to Washington in 85, I think Biden occasionally will, of course, he'll say something political, or take a shot at Republicans, or exaggerate some problem, or or take more credit than he deserves or something, I suppose. But he's been a pretty old-fashioned president in the sense that I think he really does think he's there to do a job, and he assumes, I think, that if he does a pretty decent job, people will see that he's doing a decent job.
Yeah, but does that get your votes?
I don't know. I mean, it's so polarized that Republicans seem to be unaware of the good things he's done. And I would say also, expectations, and I don't know, we sort of, we don't understand how difficult some of these things are. So, a lot of Democrats and liberals are sort of unhappy about this or that he's made some compromises they think he shouldn't have made. So now maybe at the end of the day, they come back to him, but I am a little startled at his approval rating not being a little bit higher. At the end of the day, if you had told us all in the middle of the pandemic that this is where we'd be economically, if you had told me at the beginning of the Ukraine war that we would have NATO working well and that Ukraine would be doing okay, and that we have a real chance to actually help Ukraine regain its territory and really establish an incredibly important principle in Europe and the world, that dictators don't get to invade neighboring countries and commit brutal war crimes and get away with it. I would say, I don't know, that president probably should have a decent approval rating, but voters don't seem to see it that way.
You did find a bit of hope in Wisconsin. You talked about, after years of state GOP skullduggery, Republican lawmakers making common cause with Democrats on election oversight. And all we've heard for several years is restriction of voter rights, is recrafting districts in order to exclude or isolate or ghettoize representatives of color and voters of color. What's going on that you find some hope in this, given that the courts have consistently seemed to support gerrymandering for political purposes rather than representative purposes? What's happening?
And this is a piece of the Bulwark by Bill Leaders, who is in Wisconsin and quite a well-known journalist there, saying, there's behind this, sort of beneath the radar, like 3 Republicans and 3 Democrats have gotten together in the legislature there to at least to endorse, in a bipartisan way, certain election provisions of election law that would just make the elections work better and strengthen the ability of beef up the election administrators a little bit, protect them a little bit from both threats of violence and also from the irrational legal challenges and so forth. And he argues, and I think he knows what he's talking about, that this is actually in Wisconsin, which has been highly polarized, that maybe this shows that people are getting a little sick of it. Maybe some Republicans are breaking away and saying, well, we got to make the elections work well, and we cannot go down this path in 2020 again. And I wonder, I don't know, I'm sort of pessimistic about this being a big phenomenon, at least in the very near future. But I think all of us have also seen, you see occasionally little pieces of evidence of some Republicans saying, well, this is not, we can't go down this path forever. And a lot of them would like Trump to go away or Trump to lose finally, and then they'll be a little bolder about stepping up. But of course, that's a bit of a catch-22 because Trump's not going away until people defeat him. And if he wins the nomination, we're stuck for about 18 more months with at least for the Trump-dominated party. And I'm not sure even if he loses in 2024 that his people don't disappear unless they're repudiated. So an awful lot of Republicans would like to get beyond Trump without actually confronting Trump. These Wisconsin Republican state legislators, though, have confronted the Trumpy elements in their own party, at least on this one issue. And that maybe that's a bit of a good sign.
We also have, I think, fully half of states now have some restrictions on abortion in the wake of Roe versus Wade. The courts are considering whether or not to criminalize, illegalize mifepristone, which has been on the market for more than 20 years. And we just had North Carolina override the governor's veto, in part thanks to a Democratic representative who campaigned as pro-choice and all of a sudden turned out against this. Crazy stuff that I don't think we would have seen even a half dozen years ago. So while you may see some advances in a state like Wisconsin, it looks like generally Republicans are pushing back against the will of the people. We saw the results in 2022, and they're doubling down on that, saying, no, hate us even more, vote against us even more.
I mean, some of them certainly are, and the redder the state, I guess there's more pressure on them to do this kind of thing, and maybe they feel they won't pay a price. And it's true that, look, Florida and Texas are big states with large metropolitan areas, and Florida is now a Republican state, but it was +3 for Trump in 2020. And DeSantis at least campaigned as a pretty strong pro-life Republican and won by 19 points in Florida. And in Texas, Governor Abbott and the legislature there had passed all kinds of really bad, from my point of view, legislation on not just on abortion, but on voting and on just all kinds of sort of culture
Guns.
war nonsense, And they all got, he and the other people, including Dan Patrick, the lieutenant governor, who's been indicted for like, I don't know, 8 crimes or something, all got reelected. So they don't feel they paid much of a price politically. Now, there are some who have. I do think the abortion issue helped Democrats in 2022, and they may be underestimating how much of a price they could still pay in 2024. And there is some evidence in some states that voters really don't like the MAGA extremism when they really see it clearly and have the ability to repudiate it. So Wisconsin, just to come back to that state, there was that judicial election, what was that, 2-3 months ago, where Wisconsin's been a very, very close state in all elections, like 1 point basically, and the Democrat won by, in effect, Democrat. It's allegedly a nonpartisan election, but
and flip the court.
Judge won by 10 points and flipped the court. And there were some elections just yesterday, mayor of Jacksonville, a couple of mayoral elections, where Democrats won in places, Colorado Springs. I know Denver, I know Colorado a little bit. Colorado Springs is a pretty conservative place. They've had a Republican mayor for 45 years, and a Democrat, actually a Black Democrat, won that race pretty easily. Now, I mean, there are always these local issues that you don't know about from far away if you haven't been following it. So I don't quite know what's happening in Jacksonville or Colorado Springs. Maybe the MAGA radicalism and extremism is, really turning off more and more voters, and really, that would be good. And that if that really carries through to November 24, we could finally get, the problem's not going away. These people aren't just disappearing, and the Republican Party isn't suddenly going to snap to it and become, the John McCain Republican Party. But we might be over the worst of it. But we'll see. Because Trump remains very formidable, and we'll see what happens over the next 18 months.
We have a couple of people, Barbara and Patricia, wondering about Kamala Harris on the ticket and what effect she's going to have. Clearly, she helped Biden win in 2020. To what extent is she a detriment and an asset again this time around?
Very hard to say. I mean, people really do vote for president almost always, not for vice president. I'm nervous. I mean, I said this is someone who supported Biden in 2020 and expect to do so if assuming he's the Democratic nominee in 24. I'm a little nervous about it, but so what? I mean, Biden will be the oldest person to run for president, obviously, at 82, and Kamala Harris, fairly or unfairly, and it could quite possibly be unfairly. I worked for a vice president who I thought was unfairly treated. It's a hard job to have and to really distinguish yourself in, and once you get a bad rap, it's hard to change it. But she's not, hugely popular. So the combination of Biden and Harris, and honestly, if you combine a little bit of old-fashioned racism and misogyny, probably it's maybe a little tougher for the Democrats to win with that than some other ticket we could invent. I would have preferred. A lot of my Democratic friends don't agree with me. The advantage of Biden and Harris running again is they're incumbents. Incumbents usually win. The country's not in bad shape. At the end of the day, Trump probably will be an unacceptable alternative. So they probably win just like they did in 2020. I'm a little nervous, though, about lack of generational change, about Trump looking vigorous, which he did at the CNN town hall. He tells his lies with great vigor, and Biden looking less so. Harris looking not being so attractive to some swing voters, and I would have liked, maybe they did think about this. I would have liked the Biden people to think harder about whether he should have stuck with his notion that he was be a bridge to the future, that he would arrange a transfer in the sense of not arrange a transfer, that'd be a primary, but say I'm one-term president. I think I could do the very good job for one term, and he has done a good job. And I'm going to then let's have an open, fair competition and see who's the nominee to replace me. And maybe it should be Gretchen Whitmer, and maybe it should be Josh Shapiro, and maybe it should be Kamala Harris, and maybe it should be Pete Buttigieg. We have a very good slate of people: cabinet officers, senators, governors, vice president, and let's let them all run. And then I'll be here as president until January 20th, 2025. And I look forward to handing off the baton to the next generation of, centrist, democratic, responsible leadership. I personally think they could have pulled that off. All most of my Democratic friends think too risky, can't have wide open primary. Let's just stick with Biden Harris. Obviously, that's what Biden has decided for now, at least. And so it's Biden Harris. And
I think even Teddy Roosevelt got caught up on that one. So
yeah, exactly. No, I mean, I may be too fanciful in thinking that, I honestly, I would prefer if you could snap your fingers and have a Whitmer Warnock ticket. I would prefer it. I mean, I think fresh, because voters are in such a sour mood and they're so, they're going to blame Biden for God knows what, everything that they don't like. And that could give them an excuse to stay home a little bit, even if they don't vote for Trump. And I feel like the Democratic message is pretty strong, not perfect, but pretty strong. And the evidence, incidentally, you've got Whitmer next week. She won by 10 points in Michigan. So, I mean, we have like empirical evidence that a competent Democrat who's pretty centrist can do pretty well in a swing state. Shapiro won by 15 points in Pennsylvania, had a particularly bad opponent. So you could say that's a little exceptional, but Warnock won in Georgia, so it's not like Democrats aren't doing okay in some of these key states. And, I wish it were bigger margins in some of them. But I personally would prefer a younger Democratic ticket. I just feel like people want to turn the page. They want to move to the future, to the next generation. But Biden can also say, look, one more term for me, I will continue to make progress and stabilize the situation, and then you'll get a chance to have the next generation of Democrats.
If you tuned in last week, you would have thought it was 2016 again. You had a town hall that was packed with Trump supporters who were told they could cheer but not boo, and questions that really didn't drill down in the same kind of answers that we have heard again and again and again and again. You could have almost plugged in news clips from a year ago, 2 years ago, 3 years ago, and gotten the same answers, all of which suggests that does the press still have no idea how to cover Trump, even though he's been impeached twice, even though he's got criminal cases hanging over his head in Georgia and New York, and we just saw a civil judgment in New York as well. Has anything changed?
Yeah, no, I think the press does not have much of an idea. It's not so easy, to be fair, but about how to cover Trump differently, than why they would just give him a town hall with the Republican audience. I mean, even if you say that of all Trump supporters, any Republican audience is going to be 2/3 Trump supporters. We know what his approval rating is among Republicans. It's even higher than 2/3. So what is that? I mean, if you're gonna have a town hall, at least have it with a mixture of Democrats, independents, and Republicans. But I guess they were casting it as a Republican primary thing, So I think Caitlin Collins did her best. I mean, but it's totally unfair to her, really, to put her up there with Trump. And look, Trump is a good demagogue. We shouldn't, people can make fun of him all they want, and he's lazy, and he's out Mar-a-Lago, and he lies just unbelievably recklessly and fluently. But he does lie fluently. And what a friend of mine, I was in Europe, so I didn't see it, and I probably wouldn't have watched it anyway, too painful, But a friend of mine made a very good point. He said he's a con man and a demagogue. Con men get better at being con men the more they're con men, right? I mean, they learn from how to do the con well. My friend had a shrewd point, I think, which is he said he thought actually Trump was better than he was in 2015-16. He's really become fluent at lying. He's utterly shameless. He knows he can get away with anything. He just says it, and then there's in the old days, he might have been a little embarrassed to attack Jean Carroll, who would just want a judgment against him and just to ridicule her shamelessly. But he did so. And of course, he's corrupted, if that's the right word, his supporters so much, or they've gotten so used to it and they turn out to enjoy it, which is pretty horrible, that they applaud. And so, I mean, you really get this terrible vision of Trump, but also what the effect he's had on the character, I guess you'd have to say, of some of his supporters and what they're willing to say and to do now. And so, but my friend was struck, who watched it here, that Trump was not, liberals shouldn't kid themselves that Trump isn't effective in certain ways. He's very used to doing this. He did it for 30, 40 years as a public figure before becoming president, did it in 2016, did it in 2020, even though he was the incumbent and there were a million reasons to vote him out, he made it a reasonably close race. So he is, as I say, he's a good demagogue and an effective demagogue and a dangerous demagogue.
One man whom a lot of Republicans had been hoping would ride into the breach and give them an opportunity to sideline Trump is Ron DeSantis of Florida, who's done very well in Florida, but up against even the larger Republican culture. This is somebody who's been attacking Mickey Mouse. This is a guy who brushed off Ukraine's plight as if it were crumbs on his tie. And he's really stumbled in terms of the larger public arena outside of Florida lately. Is his goose cooked? Is his Mickey Mouse cooked?
Yeah, no. So I think, I mean, others have stumbled early in campaigns and been able to, get a restart. I think he's trying to do that now. I went to Iowa and New Hampshire and had a pretty decent trip apparently there, and he'll launch, I think, in the next weekend, a weekend after this. And he might be able to get a little momentum back. He did have that month or two where he looked like the salvation to some of the Republican donors and members of Congress. He was going to be the salvation of the party after 2022. The election deniers had lost. So DeSantis had all the culture war stuff without the Trump baggage, allegedly. Turned out Trump's a better demagogue. I mean, DeSantis made some mistakes. Trump recovered, I've got to say, and sort of realized what he had to do. And Trump's just a better demagogue than DeSantis. I mean, DeSantis sort of believes what he sees on Fox, that people are all upset about Disney. I mean, think about Trump. Does Trump ever attack a corporation like Disney? No. Does he attack most major U.S. corporations? Not really.
No, he always kicks down.
He always kicks down because he is a bully. But and I hate to say this, it's a terrible thing, but that's smart of him in a way, right? He attacks marginalized groups, he attacks minorities, he attacks groups that frankly are not so popular with some of the American public because of whatever bigotry and prejudice and other things, or unfamiliarity with them. He takes the worst. He takes an issue like crime and demagogues that, but crime is a real thing, right? So I mean, it's not like it's smart. It's a smart thing to demagogue about. I was very struck with it. DeSantis is like in the Fox, online bubble and thinks that everyone's upset about wokeness and about Mickey Mouse and Disney World, and most people, including most Republicans, have been to Disney World. I guess out there, you guys go to Disneyland, right? And are not sitting around being really upset about the Walt Disney Corporation. So Trump is a smarter demagogue. This really came home to me when the Silicon Valley Bank went under. And it was a weekend, right? It was a Friday into a weekend. And so they each had statements they had to kind of come up with pretty quickly. And DeSantis, I think, said in an interview on Sunday morning, this is because of DEI, it's because of diversity. It was a woke bank, really. I mean, Silicon Valley Bank, I don't think so. And it was because of their diversity, equity, and inclusion criteria, which seemed to be nothing more than just some stuff on the website, that every corporation now has.
Boilerplate, right?
What?
Boilerplate.
Yeah, I mean, there was no evidence that they had done anything. I mean, they made idiotic bets on interest rates and all that, but that nothing. But anyway, it was like so much into a certain kind of right-wing bubble, whereas Trump was much better. Trump said, "This is Biden's fault. He doesn't know how to run the economy. Interest rates are too high. We're gonna have a depression." And when I was president, none of this stuff happened. Now it's all like a farrago of myths and lies and just kind of BS, he's going to cause a depression. I'm not. But in a way, it's a much more sensible kind of demagoguery than DeSantis is. And it's people think, oh, yeah, you know what? This didn't happen under Trump, did it? So maybe we need Trump back so the economies, we don't have a banking crisis. It doesn't move a huge number of voters, but there's some on the margin who could talk themselves into being for Trump, even though they might not like him much for that reason. Whereas DeSantis has gone way so far down the culture war rabbit holes that I don't think it's helped it. Now, maybe he can still recover. I think there is some mood in the party to move on from Trump, but DeSantis may have just missed his opportunity. He had a moment there where he was surging and he could really pull kind of even with Trump. And I think there was a moment where people might have said, you know what, let's just move on. For now, I think that's subsided and Trump is back on top.
As long as we've stopped in Silicon Valley, because Congress did such a bang up job of regulating the internet, how do you think it's going to handle AI, which seems like the cause du jour?
It is. I mean, it's a big deal. I ran into someone whom I know is in that world, and does investing and so forth, knows quite a lot about it, physics, PhD type. And 2 or 3 years ago, he was a little bit, look, it's a big deal, machine learning and AI, and obviously it's moving ahead, but it's moving ahead at a certain pace, but it's not going to transform everything overnight. That was kind of his message, and now I ran into him the other day, and he's a little startled by what's happened over the last 6 months. I mean, the actual progress of AI and machine learning, and the degree to which we're not too sure where it goes, and the military implications, the financial implications, obviously the social implications in all kinds of ways, the disinformation implications. I mean, Congress isn't even close. I mean, needless to say, is not even at step one of like thinking about whether one should try to regulate this or even find out what's happening really. And so, no, I think it's yet another sort of chaotic element in our very chaotic system here. It just adds another element of chaos into an already chaotic situation.
Um, Before the Civil War, there was a pro-slavery member of Congress who beat nearly to death an anti-slavery member of the United States Senate. And that violence was startling then, but we just saw this week that 2 staffers for a Democratic congressman in the field office in Virginia were beaten by a man with a baseball bat. An aide to Congressman Gosar in Arizona was shown to be a sympathizer with one of the leading elements of the neo-Nazi group that stormed the Capitol. It seems to be that the poison is all throughout the system now. I mean, these are 2 examples that one hopes aren't going to be repeated, but it just seems like the climate suggests this or even invites it somehow.
No, I worry a lot about that. I think by the degree to which it's permissible for political figures to kind of suggest that violence would be a good idea or invoke it, or at least not denounce it the moment you see it from either side. But the moment, especially on the Republican, the degree to which on the Republican side, it's become fashionable to kind of either wink at it or as I say, almost call for it in a kind of extreme case is worrisome. There's no, oh, look, the gun fetish is part of that. You can be plenty of gun owners in America, plenty of gun owners in American history, and you can have reasonable debates about gun policy, obviously, but the kind of fetishization of assault weapons and of weapons of war, and let's send out a Christmas card with not just me, Congressman so-and-so, and not just Mrs. Congressman so-and-so, but also my kids who range down to age 5. And that'll be funny, because it's really a funny thing to talk about AR-15s and at a moment when every week there's a shooting in either a school or a church or some office or something like that.
A 12-year-old boy
what are people
shooting an
thinking?
employee at a fast food place.
Yeah, what are people thinking when they do that? Well, what they're thinking is, I guess some people like it, but I think that I'm worried about violence. I'm worried about it 2024. I was worried about it 2022, and there wasn't as much as I feared there might be. I thought if Carrie Lake lost by, what did she lose by, 17,000 votes in Arizona, you really could have violence at the Capitol or where they're counting the votes. And luckily, the system sort of held in a way. But I don't know. The degree to which people are willing to just talk about it as almost an option, it is a little bit like the 1840s and 1850s.
And it's in part, you don't see any pushback from the representatives on whose behalf supposedly this stuff is being done.
Well, that's the thing, right? I mean, yeah, exactly. I mean, you need to really have the people on the side for whom the violence is being done, so to speak, or in whose name it's being done. But no, Trump has, look, from the beginning, I remember how shocked we all were in 2015, 16, beat those guys up in the crowd. And hey, cops, when you're arresting these people, give them a little, it's president of the United States or candidate for president can't say that. Whatever, we know that cops, don't behave perfectly all the time. And people can sit around a bar late at night and say, that guy deserved to get what he got. But I mean, president of the United States, 4 years of Trump, and there are other things than Trump, don't get me wrong, but I do think Trump is really important. This 4 years of having a president legitimate this and in a sense unlock all these things that were kind of kept under wraps, mostly, not entirely, in our country and in our politics. And it's now loose, as you said. It sort of feels like it's out there. And how do you get the toothpaste back in the tube? And that's hard, right? And this is where you look at it from Europe, and you think Europeans have seen this. They've seen the ethnic violence. They've seen obviously authoritarian violence. They've seen political parties that have sort of paramilitary associations attached to them, who sometimes will beat up the opponents of the political party or make it easier, intimidate opponents of the political party. And I used to minimize this. I'm Jewish. I used to minimize some of the I get occasional, of course, threatening, letters and all this kind of thing. And I used to, some kook writes something, you're not going to do anything. But I've got to say, it's not for me, but I mean for others and for those who are much more vulnerable. It's unnerving. It is unnerving what we're seeing out there, I think.
Can we get a quick answer for Dan before we go to the wrap up? Dan wants to know what is going on with the DOJ and Georgia cases against Trump. Any forward motion, and is any of it going to make any difference?
I don't know how much difference it will make, if any. Yes, I think George is going to indict. I think, but more importantly, perhaps, I think the Justice Department will indict Trump both on the documents. I think that'll be pretty soon. I would just think next month, and then probably later in the summer on January 6th. One assume, one's instinct is to say no won't make any more difference than the New York DA indictment made, or even the verdict in the civil case with Jean Carroll. But I don't know. You never know. Maybe cumulatively at some point people think, oh, this is just too much. But it certainly hasn't been too much yet.
And they would also need a viable alternative to be able to go, not this time.
Right. I mean, yeah, it could be DeSantis, could be someone else, I guess. But look, I mean, we're 5 months in, aren't we, to the year? What are we, January, February, March, April, May? Yeah, so almost 5 months in, the year's almost half over. At the beginning of 2023, a lot of us were saying, well, let's see how Trump does in the first part of the year. And the truth is, Trump has had a good first half of the year.
We try to wrap up on a positive note. Maybe you can bring a good news story, or at least a hopeful one.
I think Ukraine's going to do pretty well in their, who knows, but I think they're going to do pretty well in their offensive here in the next few weeks and months. I think the Russian military is pretty rickety, and the regime might be rickety. And look, if Ukraine can win, even if it doesn't fully get every inch back, but basically can win and end up in a pretty good situation, that will be a huge victory for decency, for civilization, for freedom. Zelensky's been an inspiring leader and a good reminder that we need to fight for liberal democracy. And I think the degree to which the nations of Europe have rallied, including a lot of the little nations, which have been in the forefront, the Baltic nations, the Nordic nations, some of the Central and Eastern European nations. I was in the Czech Republic last week, really moving. And they have 9 million people, 500,000 Ukrainian refugees, totally accepted. Kids are going to school, people are working. We had a Ukrainian Uber driver in Prague. No resentment, apparently. They elected a kind of liberal, democratic, centrist president about 6 weeks ago in the Czech Republic, so not much of a backlash or anything. You think, you know what, liberal democracy maybe is a little stronger than we think, but we have a challenging 18 months ahead.
And with some members of the Republican Party who are indifferent or even hostile to the Ukrainian cause, will Ukrainian advances get them to shut up, or are they still going to be counting pennies and say this is why we can't support Ukraine?
I think some of them won't shut up, but I do think the advances would make a big difference. Yeah.
And what will that mean as far as Putin and whether he becomes more dangerous to the West and how that manifests itself?
I think the most dictators like Putin become more dangerous the more they get away with things. And he got more dangerous after 2008 with Georgia, and 2014 when he took Crimea. That a defeat for Putin would be very good for liberal democracy and for the West.
And for Biden?
And for Biden, it should be. He's done a good job on Ukraine.
Well, Bill Kristol, I'm always happy to talk to you, even if I'm not happy hearing what you've got to say. You always have good reasons for saying it, and we always, I think, find some hope in what it is that you're telling us. Thank you so much.
Well, thanks, Pat. No, and I am hopeful. We should be optimistic, and optimists have ended up being right most of the time.
I'm glad to hear it. We want to remind you that next Wednesday, the program is with the governor of a key battleground state. That's Michigan's Governor Gretchen Whitmer, talking with Larry Mantle of LAist about that battleground state from the point of view of the state capital. And you see all the other programs up on the screen. We hope you'll be able to join us for all of those. Thanks to all of you for watching this evening. Love your feedback, love your support. Let's hear more of it. Thanks again.